Hello there, you're watching the press preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they come into us. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be seeing what's making the headlines with the news editor at the Institute of Economic Affairs, Kate Andrews, and Kevin Schofield, editor of PoliticsHome. So very good evening to both of you.
Hi.
So let's take a look then at the front pages. And sexual harassment is the lead for many. Theresa May is determined to take tough action to protect Westminster staff from any sexual harassment due to allegations that emerged over the weekend. That's on the front of The Guardian. The Metro says Theresa May has ordered an investigation into the harassment allegations of her cabinet. Likewise, The Telegraph says that Theresa May will dismiss any cabinet ministers if proven to be sex pests after 13 MPs have been accused of harassment in Westminster. The Times is also running the same story. They say Theresa May has been struggling to keep up with the tide of sexual harassment allegations after 2 senior MPs were accused of inappropriate behaviour. The Financial Times says that Spain will be facing a crucial test of its authority over Catalonia when regional government ministers open under the control of Madrid tomorrow. The Express says a new study found that being married or in a loving relationship could reduce the threat of developing dementia by as much as 60%. And the Daily Star says that British jihadis returning from Syria could get a free council house. So let's chat through some of those stories then with Kate Andrews and Kevin Schofield. And the story dominating a lot of the papers is of these allegations of sexual harassment at the heart of Westminster. As I say, a number of papers are covering it. There's the Telegraph's take. May will sack any sex pest ministers. And today she has come out and said we do need tougher rules because at the moment the regulations don't have enough teeth, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me as if these allegations have rather blindsided this Westminster establishment. It's an open secret, I think it's safe to say, around Westminster that this type of behaviour goes on.
So none of this talk has come as a surprise to you? You've been working at Westminster for many years.
I think maybe the extent of it is a surprise, but the fact that it goes on, I think, is just in any workplace. I mean, there are a lot of people, hundreds of people work in the Palace of Westminster, so I guess it's inevitable that this type of behaviour will go on. But there is also a sort of different power dynamic, particularly amongst male MPs with maybe younger members of staff. You know, it's not a very, there's quite an imbalance there almost. So perhaps that means it's more prevalent than maybe in other workplaces. But certainly the Prime Minister's tried to get on the front foot on this today. She's written to John Bercow, Common Speaker, to say that we need to get tougher, more easier ways for victims to complain in confidence about the behaviour that they have suffered. But I mean, it was a pretty horrendous round of Sunday newspaper headlines for the government, mainly Conservative MPs. In fact, pretty much all Conservative MPs at the centre of these allegations today. And obviously we know that the Prime Minister is already in a pretty weak spot, and it's a scandal that she can
that's right.
ill afford to be experiencing.
Absolutely, and obviously we don't have details on many of the allegations, but this headline is significant, isn't it? May will sack any sex pest ministers should anyone be found guilty of any impropriety. It's a difficult decision for her, given her wafer-thin majority, or a majority that's only really there thanks to the DUP.
Oh, absolutely. I think she deserves credit for coming out with a headline like this, coming out with that strong narrative saying that this will not be tolerated, regardless of what the outcome is, because, as you say, her majority, or her number of MPs is at risk. It's not a majority. That's the problem for her. And so her coming out and saying this, knowing that she could be risking her own leadership position, says something very strong about how this cannot be tolerated. The Daily Telegraph says that it's 13 MPs accused of harassment. The Times is leading with dozens. We do not know how far this extends. And I think when Jared Amara was suspended last week, something like this was bound to happen. This was always going to be prevalent across the political spectrum because, as you say, that power dynamic can be so unhealthy and can put particularly young people at risk. I think Isabel Hardman had a really fantastic piece earlier this week when she said you can't go around pointing fingers as a party without knowing that you are completely clean and that you haven't done anything wrong. I think, unfortunately, so unfortunately, this is something that particularly young women face all the time in every workplace, and it was bound to come out from the Conservative side as well.
Well, that's right. And I guess, that, as you say, there's something about the nature of the way that Westminster works. There are people who work sometimes just directly with one person, so it's difficult for them to necessarily report anything that they're unhappy with, but also the nature of the way that MPs work. Often they have two homes, don't they? So they're working away from home, there are lots of bars, it's late
long
working.
hours, unusual, antisocial.
Not that excuses any of it.
No, but it's an odd environment. You know, people work very long hours, and in most cases, the younger aides to MPs, they'll be maybe wanting to be MPs themselves. They're very, very ambitious, so they probably feel under pressure to work these long hours and accept sort of unacceptable practices in the workplace. And as I say, the Prime Minister's now trying to almost try to catch up with the scandal as it's running away from.
It is just shocking, though, isn't it? And I think a lot of this has come out in the allegations against Harvey Weinstein, and people are feeling more and more comfortable to come forward and say this is intolerable. It's great that May's saying we're going to set up structures so it's easier to complain, it's easier to say when you've experienced inappropriate behavior. But fundamentally, we already have rules around this. It's called the law. You can't go around sexually harassing people. You can't sexually assault people. The fact that anyone's doing this and elected representatives are doing this, I mean, no one can do it. But there's this optimistic part of me that likes to think, wow, if you're actually been elected to represent people, be above it all. Try to be the best person you can be. Everyone, including politicians, is unfortunately not exempt from this general rule that young people are put at risk.
And it comes at a time when sort of trust in politicians and respect for politicians is probably at an all-time low. You know, the expenses scandal wasn't that long ago. The public perception of MPs is at a pretty low ebb, and this, I think, plays into that idea that, you know, it's all a bit unsavoury.
And there will, of course, be questions asked about who knew what and when as well, I'm sure.
But gosh, I mean, they can't roll out universal credit. You know, there's one of the stories we're going to speak about tonight is about the NHS and funding around it. And then when something like this comes out, it's like, what on earth have you been doing?
Yeah.
You know, what have you been up to? It's really hard to stomach, I think, as the general
before
public.
We start talking about Brexit.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, how are we going to extricate ourselves from the European Union while people were saying, how have you got time to be getting up to all this misbehaviour?
Yeah.
OK, let's move on to the other big story that's been around all weekend, of course. It's still the lead on tomorrow's Financial Times. And this is the big test day tomorrow after an extraordinary weekend of events in Catalonia. So the Catalonian government has been sacked by Madrid. They've returned to direct rule, but there's a big question Monday morning tomorrow. Those politicians say, no, we were democratically elected, we're turning up for work. Will they be arrested? What will happen next? There are a lot of questions.
It's very concerning about the direction this could go. The Spanish government obviously has a tough role to play in the sense that they want to make sure that the people of Catalonia are protected underneath their branch, but also that this doesn't get violent. I think there's still questions to be answered about how the referendum was handled by the police in particular and by the Spanish government. I don't want to put that aside completely. That has to be addressed. But overall, I think the Spanish government is making the right decision here. The polls, even most recently taken on Friday, suggest that the majority of Catalans do not want independence.
And this was, sorry, just to draw attention to the picture, because that was a pro-unity march in Barcelona today.
Yes, and so the rule of law has to be upheld in many respects here, but it's going to be a very delicate balance about how they get that right. And I think they're completely correct to hold these general elections so soon, because the Catalan politicians are going to have to focus on that, and they're really going to have to go back to the people and discuss independence from a political and calm perspective.
Well, yeah, absolutely, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out tomorrow if the Catalan ministers, including the president, turn up for work as normal and are effectively barred from their offices by the Spanish officials. What happens then? Is there some kind of peaceful protest? We hope it's peaceful, but it could potentially, it's a powder keg, you know, anything could happen. And then I suppose the danger for the Spanish government is, do they then force people who might at the moment be anti-independence, do they see them being heavy-handed and then think, well, actually, you know what, that turns me off, I'm now in favour of independence. You know, being Scottish, I've seen what this is like in Scotland during the referendum, and it hasn't really gone away despite the result of the referendum. You know, it's highly emotional situations, these, and you know, the least little bit of political overbearance can have potentially massive consequences.
And that headline on the top there in the Times as well, Catalan president faces threat of a 30-year prison sentence for carrying out an illegal referendum. What might that do to the mood there as well?
Well, quite. I mean, if you're talking about locking up politicians, you know, political prisoners, effectively.
The President of the United States speaks in that way. We really don't want to be advocating other people to be doing so. The problem here is that it's very hard to go in and start talking about the systems and democracies and rule of law in other countries that aren't your own. Spain does not have a process in which one can leave Spain in this way. They don't have a process for independence. We have to be somewhat respectful of that, but at the same time, I mean, from the PR perspective alone, but really from a human rights perspective, you don't want to go around locking up your opposition. No. So this is a terrible situation for everyone involved. We can only hope that those democratic elections in December will lead to some kind of peaceful conclusion.
What's also been interesting is the reluctance of countries around the world to recognise Catalonia as an independent state, having, you know,
certainly Britain, France, Germany, the EU,
Ireland, you know, and they've been very, very careful not to recognise what happened on Friday, you know, which again is quite an important development, I think.
I'm just going to squeeze in one more story which you spotted before we go to the break, and that is the front page of the Daily Express. Stay married to halt dementia is their quite dramatic headline. But if you read down into the copy, it talks about being in a loving relationship could reduce the threat. Does it say why?
It says healthier lifestyles of couples, which was a bit of a surprise for me. I didn't realise that couples necessarily have healthier lifestyles than
single. Depends on how healthy the couple is.
Well, quite, yeah, but it's more to do with sort of social interaction, I think, between couples. So the idea being, if you live on your own or if you're not in a relationship and you don't have any company, then you're more likely to fall victim to
towards the end of the report,
dementia.
It suggests that loneliness is the real crippling factor here for people who are more likely to get sick, which is not terribly surprising. You know, they've just looked at single people versus people in relationships. There are many ways to not be lonely if you're not in a long-term relationship, but that seems to be the major factor here.
OK, well, we are going to take a break now. Lots more to talk about coming up, including using smartphones has fallen amongst young people for the first time. Not in my house, it hasn't. We're talking about that in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me, Kate Andrews and Kevin Schofield. And we're going to return to the Daily Telegraph's front page, not to talk about the victorious Lewis Hamilton, who has obviously had an extraordinary day today, but we're actually talking about Philip Hammond down there. NHS must save to fund pay rise is their headline.
So Jeremy Hunt's come out and said that the NHS needs more money to survive, especially down the road. And Philip Hammond is now pushing back today, saying that if there's going to be more money, particularly for pay raises within the NHS, they're going to have to make efficiency gains. I'm quite sympathetic to Philip Hammond on this one. While the NHS often ranks efficiently worldwide for being able to provide as much healthcare as it does to its citizens, they also have some of the most efficiency gains to be made worldwide when we're looking at healthcare systems. There is money to be saved. To me, though, this overall argument is frustrating. The NHS is not fit for purpose down the line. Jeremy Hunt's completely right about that. We need to start thinking about the demographics in the UK, how we can reform the NHS, how, you know, not America, but people in Europe, and how countries in Europe like Switzerland and Germany are doing it a bit better. It's always a question of money, and to me, that's actually the secondary issue.
And of course, it's always a very difficult one to handle. People feel very emotionally attached to the NHS as well. But plus, it's a reminder, isn't it, of Philip Hammond and how little room for manoeuvre he has in his upcoming budget. Very,
very little room for manoeuvre. I mean, essentially, we have no money. So at the same time, there is this political imperative that the public sector pay cap has to be lifted. That's been accepted now. But where does the money come from? And Philip Hammond, on the one hand, is trying to help or he's under pressure from Downing Street, from his next door neighbour, to sort of have some kind of rabbits out the hat, a few giveaways in the budget to try and seize the political initiative from Labour. But as you say, his room for manoeuvre is minimal at best. You know, so where does he find the cash from? And
talking of former chancellors, well, I'm not saying Philip Hammond's obviously not a former chancellor, but the person we're about to is, or is he? I don't know. Gordon Brown saying, I didn't show enough emotion to win the election.
Yeah, he's got his autobiography coming out in the next few weeks, and there's a few excerpts being embargoed into tomorrow's newspapers, and the standout line from it is essentially Gordon Brown saying that ahead of the 2010 election he felt that he wasn't sort of the politician of that era. If you remember, he was up against David Cameron, young, slick, Nick Clegg as well, obviously Cleggmania. It seems like an awful long time ago now. But again, they were seen as sort of younger, more in touch. It's hard to believe now. Politicians compared to Gordon Brown, who'd been around the block. He'd been in power for 10 years, Prime Minister for 3. And he said it basically, the modern version of connecting seems to increasingly include a public display of emotion, which he couldn't do. But what I find interesting about that is that you could almost change the name here to Theresa May.
Or Hillary Clinton.
Or Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, a lot of politicians in the past few years where it just hasn't, we know that they are qualified technically, but why they want to govern, what their purpose is, has not been made clear very well to the public. And people want politicians that they can get behind now. I think Brown excuses himself and his policies a little bit too much in terms of how he handled the economy, and also any government that was overseeing the financial crash was just automatically going to be in a weaker position, and so that didn't play for him. But it's so interesting to hear these politicians now who do come across as statesmen, who really are that grown up in the room, reflect upon what is happening to our politics currently and where that drive of emotion is coming from. They are two completely different kinds of politicians and political eras.
And so interesting, isn't it, when you get that frankness from politicians who no longer are trying to appeal for votes. You know,
well, that's the thing. Perhaps if he'd been as frank when he was trying to get re-elected as Prime Minister, maybe he might have been a little bit more successful. I'm
going to try and squeeze in two stories, which might be ambitious, but let's try it. Trump on this page. Oh, well, this is the suggestion that there may be charges about to be brought, or certainly big developments in the investigation into the Trump campaign and its links potentially to Russia.
So the special counsel led by Robert Mueller is now going to have the opportunity, if they see it fit and if they have the evidence, to arrest people around these allegations that the Trump campaign was colluding with the Russians. It doesn't mean that anybody will be arrested. We don't have the details of that yet. At this time, we still don't have evidence, at least publicly, that the Trump campaign did collude with the Russians, but it's one to watch. This is, I think, going to be a big determining factor in the next few years about whether or not Trump is completely on his way out or whether or not the Democrats have really built this up and it's a non-story.
One to watch. I am going to whiz on. Sorry, Kevin.
That's all right.
Chance to say anything on that because I promised I'd talk about this story, which fascinates me. Smartphone use falls amongst young for the first time. I'm slightly gobsmacked.
It is one of those jaw-dropping headlines because you just assume that the use of smartphones, particularly amongst young people, is just going to continue rising exponentially. But, you know, albeit it is a small drop from those aged 16 to 24 apparently spent an average of 3.8 hours a day on the devices, which is an awful long time when you think you're only awake for about, what, 16 hours.
You're a teenager, a couple of hours, right?
Oh, yeah. And it's down from 3.9 hours last year, so it's not much. No. But if it's the beginning of a trend, it's interesting. It says that young people now think it's actually not good for their mental health, and they don't open apps as much, put the phone away at 7 o'clock at night. I mean, I'm as guilty as anyone. I would love to think that I'd start using it a bit less from next year. I can't promise.
Sadly, maybe we'll discuss it a little bit longer. And what they're doing instead, are they playing Scrabble? I wonder. Anyway, we'll see you both again at 11:30 though. Thanks very much.